Hey Art Nerds! So recently the 7-inch Kara Volume 2 Kickstarter launched. I am so excited about that I painted this beautiful watercolor illustration to help celebrate. If you guys enjoy my watercolor art, if you enjoy my tutorials, if you enjoy my reviews, if they've helped you in any way, it would really mean the world to me if you would check out 7-inch Kara Volume 2 on Kickstarter and maybe consider supporting the work. It's been 6 years of painting and I'm very proud of it, so I look forward to sharing it with you guys. So for this piece, I started with 3 different thumbnails that you guys can see here. I let people on my Patreon and on YouTube in the community tab vote on it, and then we selected one and I created 3 thumbnails for that. And you can see those here. This is the digital sketch, so what I did is I selected one of my favorite thumbnails, scanned it, and then began sketching on top of it, just kind of blocking everything in. And then this is the final sketch. Everything's been tightened up. I converted that to blue lines and printed it on 300-pound Arches watercolor paper. I then penciled it using an HB lead like you see here, and then I stretched it, and when I stretched it, the blue lines that you can just very faintly see lifted up and left us with just the pencil lines. My little magic trick. I have lots of tutorials here on this channel where I show you guys how to stretch watercolor paper. So if you're interested in learning how to do that, I've got you covered. I've also got several great watercolor playlists if you're interested in learning how to paint, or if you're looking for recommendations on paints. I also have loads of great watercolor paint reviews. I'll make sure I'll link those in the cards and in the description below. I'll also pop a link to the 7-inch Kara Volume 2 Kickstarter in the cards and in the description as well. So the first thing I did is I wet the entire surface with some clean water using a mop. Then I mixed up some ultramarine, it's actually Kusakabe's hot pink, and then some cool yellow in a weld palette. Dabbled that in, wet into wet on the paper to get this beautiful sort of diffused glow. This is toning our paper. And now I'm using some ultramarine to start blocking in the shadows on all the white objects in this illustration. I also mixed up an almost skin tone color. That's going to be the color of our vanilla cake, since it's a vanilla and strawberry cake. And then I'm using the hot pink from Kusakabe to start blocking in some of the paper tissue decorations that are in the background. So for this image, I wanted really fun, bright, clean colors. I wanted to work with a limited color palette, and I wanted to use colors that felt really celebratory. So my main theme colors are yellow, hot pink, and ultramarine blue. Now, while those pinwheels were still wet, I dabbed in a darker Kusakabe hot pink and allowed that to diffuse. And where it didn't quite diffuse, I used some clean water and helped it diffuse a little bit. So for the majority of this watercolor illustration, I'm using a Winsor & Newton Series 7 in a size 7 round. So this is a Kolinsky sable brush. They are kind of pricey, but gosh, they handle so well. It's like driving, I guess, a luxury sports car. Not that I've ever had that pleasure. Y'all know I'm just an artist. We don't make a whole lot of money, but it definitely handles really well if you're big on brushwork and if you want to get away from feeling like your watercolor is just kind of color by number. This is the baby to drive, and it's such a good all-rounder. I end up using it for the majority of this piece. So as with most of my watercolor illustrations, I start by blocking things in. And for Naomi's skin, I'm starting with the blush and with the shadow color first, and I have quite a few tutorials on how to paint people here on the channel. I also did a watercolor workshop art stream a few weeks ago where I showed you guys how to mix, I want to say, like 9 different skin tones, and I have a shortened tutorial version of that as well if you don't have 3 hours to kill watching paint dry. My wonderful, amazing, phenomenal art nerds over on Patreon, of course, got it first. What's the point of being a patron if you don't get some perks? And you can become a patron too by joining me at patreon.com/natosoup. So next, I'm applying the shadow color to Naomi's skin tone. Since she has a darker skin tone, I found that it's easier to start with a base for the blush and a base for the shadow, paint the skin tone on top of that, and then only worry about painting the darkest areas of those later on. We'll talk more about that later. So mostly this stage is about assessing the colors that I'm using, the color balance that I'm achieving, adjusting it, and adding in new colors as we go along. I have the problem of overcomplicating my watercolor illustrations. Maybe you guys have noticed that. So I wanted to keep this one a little bit more simple and not overly rendered and not overly fussy. So with the paper tissue illustrations, paper tissue decorations, illustration, decoration, very similar there. I wanted to capture the different faces of like the folded paper rondels. They're kind of like paper fans where you have an accordion fold and it goes all the way around. You guys have probably seen them at Michael's. So what I'm doing is I'm painting one face of each of the kind of triangle things, if you can imagine it. One face is painted darker than the other, building up some contrast. Speaking of contrast, if you struggle to achieve enough contrast in your watercolor illustrations, I have a light and contrast watercolor series that might be helpful for you if that's something you'd like to improve on. So now that I've got that kind of established, I'm going in and adding the icing on the cake. So usually when I render white things, I use a blue to shade them, usually ultramarine blue. In this instance though, vanilla is warm. It's got kind of a brown cast if you're using real vanilla. And if Naomi made this cake, we're using real vanilla. So I wanted to capture that using a very light brown, even lighter than what I initially used on the cake interior itself. So as always, you can start to see my head in the shot. You know, I'm tired of apologizing for it because my eyesight, it is not great. It is what it is. And I've been watching a lot of other watercolor videos on YouTube, especially Chinese watercolor, and their heads get in the shot as much as mine gets in the shot. So I guess I just don't feel that bad about it anymore. So as long as you guys can tell what's going on, I'm good with it. And I do try to keep out of the shot, but I have this like flippy hair on the side of my head, and it manages to get into the camera, even if the rest of my head does not. See, there you go. It just wants to be a YouTube star, y'all. The problems with having curly, wavy hair. So with the strawberries, I wanted something. So normally I try to go with more natural colors, so I stay away from synthetic colors, but I wanted something really candy colored, fun, party, and poppy. So I used Whole Bunch Cherry Red, which is a quinacridone red. Sometimes it can feel kind of synthetic. I love the color, but it tends to be very pink. But for these strawberries, I thought it would be perfect. So I used that as the base color. Then I'm adding in another layer of contrast, a deeper mix of the Kusakabe hot pink along with a darker hot pink on our folded fan rondel things. What do you guys call those? Party decorations, probably? Tissue decorations, something like. I'm sure there's like a fion fancy name for that, but I don't know what it is. I'm also using a little bit of brush painting to paint in the roses on the china in the background. And it's based off of a tea set I had when I was much younger, especially. So anytime you see Kara's family, the Lilliputian family in 7-inch Kara, using tea sets as, you know, tableware, that's based off of a tea set I had and loved as a kid, and I think I still have some pieces for it. And you guys might see that tea set pop up in an altered form in a later video, so keep an eye out for that. And I'm using a Winsor & Newton turquoise blue for the cake stands. Those of you who've met me at cons, you guys know these cake stands. I use them to display all kinds of things. They're very sturdy and they've literally been all over the country. So why not give them a little shout out here? They're definitely workhorses. So for the inside of the cake, I'm not a big vanilla cake fan, but I really like vanilla plus fruit flavors. So just imagine that's a really delicious, slightly tart strawberry jam inside the cake. And of course, with watercolor, it's all about building up contrast. For this piece, I wanted to use ultramarine blue as a shadow color, and it's kind of inspired by one of the Painting People workshops I did on a Saturday night, where we were working a lot with Quin Magenta and ultramarine to make purples, and I really liked that mix. So I wanted to use the ultramarine as the majority, the primary shadow color in this illustration. So I'm also using it to add some shading to the tissue paper, I almost called it tipper paper, tissue paper decorations in the background. Boy, that's a tongue twister right there. I also used it as the shadow color on the cake stands, as well as the shadow color on the cotton doilies. And I start to use it as a shadow color in the cake itself and in the frosting. And normally that's something I wouldn't necessarily do. I don't normally use lighter blues as a shadow color for pinks. But I thought, you know, ultramarine blue is such a warm blue. It's such a pretty blue. And it's not too dark. So it might not desaturate things too much. So for the design, I really wanted to go with kind of a princess look for Naomi. I've drawn lots of Kara princessy kind of things, but for Naomi, she's really she's more into that kind of stuff than Kara would be. Kara is, you know, out in the grass, she's out in the woods, she's out exploring a lot, whereas Naomi is more from the city, so she doesn't have as much experience tromping around out in the grass. And also, Kara is only 7 inches tall, whereas Naomi is 5'4". So, you know, not quite as easy to go exploring in the grass as it would be for Kara. So I thought it was high time I drew and painted Naomi in something that reflects her true shoujo princess self. And it ended up looking very Barbie inspired, and I'm not gonna lie, I kind of love it. I feel like Naomi can definitely pull off this look. This look is a whole thing, but Naomi can pull it off. And it was originally inspired by a dress from Shein. I don't normally buy from Shein, but I like referencing it in Romwe and some of the other fast fashion sites when I'm picking out outfits for Naomi, because she's a teenager and I want to dress her in things that are obviously contemporary and not just terribly dated. So rather than going by like my own personal wardrobe as an adult woman, I go on sites that I think she would like, and I try to pick out outfits for her. And I did that in the bonus chapter for 7-inch Kara as well, Naomi's Big Day. So it started out as a Shein dress, and then I decided it needed to be hot pink, and then I decided the sleeves needed to be see-through. So now it's like a Shein Barbie dress, which, you know, I don't think Naomi's complaining. Whereas for Kara, if Naomi is dressed like a princess, Kara's more like a fairy tale peasant, but I don't like... Not like, you peasant, but like, you know, like a cottage girl. Somebody who lives Heidi of the Alps, you know. Somebody who has like the Mori Key aesthetic. So it's a simple white dress with an ultramarine, not really like a corset, but kind of a, I don't know, girdle? But not the way we normally think of girdles, but like old-fashioned girdle where it's just meant to just good. And unlike Naomi, Kara is enjoying a chocolate petit four because it's her size. Although, to be real, that is a whole lot of sugar for one little girl who never eats sugar. So Kara, pace yourself, girl. Maybe a little nibble at a time. I mean, just the rosebud on top, if it's a sugar rose, is way too much sugar for you. Like, way too much. It's as big as your head. Speaking of sugar, the dots on the side are like, I don't know, like candy melts or candy drops. They're not like Red Hots, because that's not a good combination. Red Hots with strawberry with vanilla cake, I don't know about that. But they ended up being more like cherry or strawberry candies. So to capture the transparent look on the puff sleeves, transparency is actually fairly easy to capture. I did a glaze of very light pink. Then I painted a couple of layers of the skin tone, so just so you can see through it, and then I added my details on top of that. The same goes for the white eyelet at the top, I decided to make that more like a semi-transparent mesh. And for that, it's even easier. I just did a glaze of Naomi's skin tone and then washed it out around the edges with a little bit of water to hint at opacity in the fabric. I also want to say this video has been time-lapsed so many times. It took about 4 days to paint this, and I was working on it the whole week before the launch while also doing a whole bunch of Kickstarter prep and doing the Kickstarter video. So it was a crazy week. But you know what? One of the beautiful things about watercolor is it can be very relaxing. So it was kind of nice to like have all that hecticness and then kind of escape into watercolor for a little while. And while Arches can be an expensive watercolor paper, this is actually paper that I cut from a 300-pound block, so that makes it even more expensive. It's a joy to paint on, and the 300-pound paper, it has a really nice definitive surface tooth. It's got a very expressive surface tooth. Like, there's no way you're missing the tooth on this paper. So if you don't like a very forward surface tooth on your watercolor paper, maybe not this. But I like a lot of tooth to my paper. I like a lot of feedback. I like being able to get a lot of dry brush, and I like being able to use a lot of water and a lot of layers, so this is a good one. You probably don't have to stretch it since it is block bound and 300 pounds, but since I ran it through my printer, I wanted to remove those blue lines, and stretching it is the way to go. So to add some depth and some shadow to our delicious strawberries, I'm using Daniel Smith's Naphthalide Maroon, which is a really dark brownish red color. I use this color all the time. You guys hear me talk about it. I love this color. And I've been getting a lot of questions about my recommendations for paints, and I'm going to do a video on my favorite palettes and my favorite colors in the near future, and do swatches and talk about why I like what I like, because I do have some very strong opinions about what I think works. I'm one of those people who advocates skipping student watercolors, and people always want to fight me on it. They're, no, my Cotmans. I need my Cotmans. I love my Cotmans. Professional is not good enough to justify the cost. I can't justify spending that. Cotman is good enough, like every time. And those are the same people where 2 years later I see them on Twitter and they're the ones advocating skipping student and going straight to professional. And I'm just like, I see you over there. It'd be cool if you'd been like Natto Soup recommended this years ago, but I get you. At least you're on the right foot now. And I've explained why I don't like student watercolors many times, but the TLDR is they're very expensive in the US compared to professional watercolors. They cost almost as much as professional watercolors. They include a lot of filler and a lot of optical brighteners, so you actually go through them more than twice as fast as you would their professional colors. And you're very limited in what colors you can mix and how much saturation you can get. You guys probably have noticed that my watercolors for watercolor are all very saturated. They lean more towards illustration in that regard and less towards what a lot of people think of like traditional watercolor. I really like that punch in the face of color, like wha-bam color. So for me, using professional grade watercolors that don't have a lot of optical brighteners and deliver a lot of pigment without turning muddy, it's really important to me. So in all the dozens of watercolor reviews I've done here on the channel, oh yeah, I've got a playlist for that. And all the field tests I've put those watercolors through, those are always properties I'm looking for. How fast do I use up the watercolor? How quickly do they reactivate? How full of binders are they? How quickly do they muddy the water? Do they turn to mud on my page? So those are all things I'm looking at. All right, I want to stop talking about that for a second here. So I added a shadow of ultramarine blue to the cake. And at first I was like, oh no, I've made a terrible mistake, because what I was looking to do is I wanted to create more of a sense of depth, more of an illusion of three-dimensionality, and I wanted the cake and the cake stance to feel closer to the viewer because perspective-wise they are. I mean, Kara herself, she's still tiny in this, but she doesn't look as tiny as she actually is because I'm utilizing a little bit of forced perspective to make her and Naomi almost at the same eye level. I've been doing a lot of illustrations like this where they're just about equals, and that's just kind of playing with perspective and playing with how the viewer would see things. I mean, realistically, if two friends were having a chat and there was such a massive size difference, Carol would probably be sitting on 2 plate stands right next to Naomi in order for them to have an actual conversation. But this is the magic of illustration, and sometimes you have to change how you stage things to make an illustration that tells the story better or conveys the thought much more quickly to the audience, or just achieves what you as the artist want the illustration to achieve. So sometimes we sacrifice realism for better storytelling. So I've zoomed in here so you can see what I'm doing with the hair a little bit better. So I do want to admit I haven't zoomed in as much as I normally would, since this is a somewhat larger piece than I normally record. The paper was 10 by 14, and I think I have a live area of probably 9 by 12, which is not huge, but given the limitations of my recording setup and the limitations of my camera arm, I can't move it around as much as I would have as if I was working on a smaller piece, and could get on top of it more and could move the illustration around my desk more to get something that's better for the camera. So that's why we're kind of limited to when we zoom in. But this works out really well because it's a good demonstration to capture the texture of Naomi's hair and how curly it is by leaving lots of highlights where the light's kind of catching the topmost part of her hair, I guess is the top part of the curl. I don't know why that suddenly became challenging for me. I do apologize. I also dipped in a little bit of Payne's gray into her hair while it's still wet to start creating this depth and this shadow. And I kind of worked on the cornet braids that go around her head kind of separately from the curls, just to help me keep track of what I'm doing and keep track of what's going on a little bit better. And if you'd like to get to know more about these unusual friends, one 7-inch tall little girl who's been sheltered her whole life, and one human teenager who was originally from New Orleans and has now moved to a very small rural town in Louisiana, I highly recommend you guys read 7-inch Kara. The second volume is on Kickstarter now, just like we talked about, but you can read all of the first volume and the first 2 chapters of the second volume as a webcomic at 7inchkara.com. And then if you like it, I would love it if you would back it on Kickstarter. Help support the printing of volume 2. So this stage, everything moves kind of quickly. Since I have all the base colors established, I start working with thicker mixes of color. I start adding in thicker details, things that would bleed, things that would run if I did them early on and I tried to glaze on top of them, or I did a really wet wash next to them. So my order of operations for watercolor is kind of similar to that the order of operations that people use for oil, where I do fat over lean. So a fat mixture would have a lot of pigment, a lot of paint in it, and a lean mixture would have more water. So you start out with really wet washes, really loose washes, really thin glazes, and you build up to your thicker colors, into your thicker saturations, into your tighter details. So with Naomi's hair, as I am kind of developing it and developing the contrast in it, I start mixing in more sepia and more black so that I can get the color depth that I need. For Kara's hair, it starts with Venetian red, then moves to Van Dyke brown, and then finally moves to sepia. And adding shadows to hot pink, like on her dress, it can be kind of challenging. It can start to look kind of muddy. So I tried to stay mostly with hot pinks, darker hot pinks, fuchsias, and more like a quin red to add the shadows in, rather than like moving towards purples like I would normally do. Now, a purple might have worked really well with this, but I was afraid it would just desaturate it too much and make that color, which is already so bright and saturated, basically neon and very poppy, I was afraid that it would basically desaturate it into mud. So I didn't want to take that risk this time. So you guys can kind of see I lost a lot of the really, really pretty color modeling that I got when I was originally toning this piece. I was kind of hoping that would show through, but since my colors are so saturated and so bright, it's very easy to lose that. So you can kind of see it on Kara's dress, and you can see it a little bit in the yellow, especially if you look at a static image of this, or if you look really closely, you can start to see it. But in the tablecloth and in the pottery and in the pinks, you lose most of that. So if that was something I mean, it is something I'd like to explore more in the future and do a better job rendering it so that it's still visible, which would mean rendering less in the watercolor. So for Naomi's skin, I basically did 3 versions of the skin tone, getting progressively darker by mixing in more browns and mixing more dark browns in. Then I used a darker mix of the shadow color, which is like a purple with a little naphthalide maroon, just to add definition shadows like under her neck and where her hair crosses over her face and under her hand. And something I've found out that I'm going to use in the near future is, so with Black people, the palms of their hands are usually lighter than the tops of their hands, and I tend to lose that when I'm doing watercolor. But a little bit of Daniel Smith buff titanium painted on top of that helps you get that back again. So I'm really glad I found that out, because it's hard for me to kind of reserve that area sometimes, especially like in this illustration where she's holding a fork and you have these shadow areas. So being able to add it again later on is really helpful. So I've pulled out my watercolor pencils. I'm using like an antique white or an off-white, I think it's a Super Color 2 color, to add in some kind of cream details here and there. And then I'm also going to use regular white to add white details to the cooler influenced areas. And using 2 different whites really helps kind of maintain a realistic color reflection. I'm also going in with a little bit of purple and a little bit of indigo. So that's Derwent Inktense. And I use them interchangeably with watercolor pencils. I really like the color delivery. They have a lot of color. They pack a lot of punch. And once I've finished with the color pencils, I'm going in with just a little bit of white gouache. It's Winsor & Newton gouache, but I'm not all that brand picky. And oh my goodness, my hair floof has taken over the whole image. I'm just adding in a little bit of white gouache here and there to start adding in some white details. So like at the tops of the frostings and on the strawberries and on some of the cutlery and to the eyes. I always use white gouache to the white of the eyes. And that really kind of helps bring the whole piece together. It ties everything together. It can hide a lot of flaws and it breathes a lot of liveliness to the art itself. So it's a really important stage. And then finally, all that's left once the watercolor has had a chance to fully dry is to remove it from its prison by removing the blue tape. So this is the launch image to celebrate the launch of 7-Inch Kara Volume 2 at Kickstarter. You can find it at 7inchkara.com/Kickstarter. That's the short link. I'll have a link down in the description below, as well as in the cards and in the ink cap. If you enjoy my art, if you enjoy the tutorials and the reviews that I share here, it would be absolutely amazing if you guys would join me for this Kickstarter. It really means a lot to me. I've spent the past 6 years painting about 200 pages of watercolor comic. It's a whole lot of painting. So I know if you enjoy my art, if you like my illustration, if you enjoy watercolor, and if you like comics, you're definitely going to like 7-Inch Kara. Just like most of my work, there's really strong Ghibli vibes. There's strong nature themes, themes of friendship, themes of family. And while there is conflict and some drama, that's not necessarily the whole point of the comic. So if you're tired of comics that kind of stress you out as you're reading them and not in a good way, 7-Inch Kara is not that kind of comic at all. So it could be a perfect way to escape right now while we're all pretty stressed out. And for those of us who maybe can't get out as much as we would like, there's so many scenes of nature, there's so much grass, and there's so much like just chill hanging out, eating treats, and hanging out with a cute cat that maybe it'll help scratch that itch for you guys and make you feel like you got a little mini vacation. And like I said earlier, if you're new to 7-Inch Kara, you can read the first 7 chapters for free at 7inchkara.com. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope to see you guys again soon.